Well, hello there, Space Monkeys. Welcome to Political Fight Club. I'm Robert Durden. Today is a very bad day for journalism. The last couple of weeks have been really bad for journalism. And today we are going to find out, this is February 20th, we're going to find out over the next couple of days if Julian Assange is in fact going to be extradited to the United States. So I highly recommend you follow some people like Matt Kennard, Richie Medhurst, there's others, on Twitter, whatever, whoever's able to have access to that, follow them to see how this unfolds today and tomorrow, and we will likely know by then whether or not an essential death sentence for Julian Assange will be handed out, because he is so in such bad health and so enfeebled mentally and physically and emotionally now. It's likely that if he gets extradited to the United States that he will die. So we need to do everything we can to be loud, to add public pressure. I would highly recommend you guys call your Congress people. That number is 202-224-3121, 202-224-3121, and ask them to sign on to House Resolution 934. That is dropping the charges against Julian Assange. That's something you can do. Highly recommend you do so. I already did, and I've written multiple letters over the years to them. Anything you can do, just raise your voice. It takes 5 minutes. Now, let's talk about other reasons or other stories that are pointing to an authoritarian crackdown on journalism, and this is just in the last 2 or 3 weeks. We're going to talk about Kit Klarenberg, a personal favorite of mine, one of the best journalists alive, has been suspended from Twitter. I'm going to read to you his most recent story, and you'll get a better idea of why he was suspended from Twitter. Anybody that tells you it was because he was being mean or he was threatening somebody, no, I've seen the tweet that he got taken down for. He's not making a direct threat. He's being a dick, but I mean, he's a good investigative journalist. I don't know any good investigative journalists who aren't dicks most of the time. And in fact, I think it's kind of a job requirement. So he didn't get banned because he did anything actually wrong. He got banned because they were looking for a reason to get rid of him, because his last 4 or 5 stories have been absolutely massive, including covering new revelations in the alleged suicide of Jeffrey Epstein. But the most recent one is he breaks down the UK's new National Security Act, which essentially is just the Espionage Act for the UK. And if you guys know anything about the Julian Assange case, it's the Espionage Act of 1918 that's being used to imprison him right now. And in fact, that's an act that was written to go after spies in World War I. So it's not meant to be used against journalists, but its language is so written so that people were worried it might be used to go after people like Assange. So the UK is now writing its own Espionage Act. We're going to cover that in detail last. The first story I'd like to get to is the whistleblower for the Vault 7 leaks. You guys remember back in the day, the Vault 7 leaks that WikiLeaks released was probably the biggest drop, most important drop anyway, that I've seen from WikiLeaks, basically showing all of the CIA's hacking and surveillance tools in detail. The guy who allegedly leaked that, Joshua Schultz, got 40 years in prison earlier this month. So I'm going to read to you here from the World Socialist website. We're going to talk about that. And then we're going to read part of an article, most of an article by Whitney Webb, talking about, and this is a very old article, about Vault 7 and how it will be used against journalism. And this was written, I mean, Whitney's way ahead of the curve. This is like 2017 she wrote this, so it's been like 7 years. She was way ahead of it. She called it perfectly. We're going to read through that. And then we're going to cover Kit Klarenberg's recent bombshell article. So it's going to be a long episode. Hang on for the ride, but it's a very important episode because essentially right now, journalism is on the chopping block today. Let's talk about Joshua Schultz. This is an article from February 2nd from Oscar Grenfell on the World Socialist website. Alleged WikiLeaks whistleblower hit with a 40-year sentence. A warning of what's in store for Assange if extradition is not defeated. In a brutal act of state vengeance, alleged WikiLeaks whistleblower Joshua Schultz was sentenced to 40 years imprisonment on Thursday over Espionage Act and other national security offenses. The 35-year-old was convicted in 2022 of transmitting documents to WikiLeaks exposing the CIA's hacking and global spying operations. The Schultz case marks a deepening of a protracted war on whistleblowers and journalism. Now, the last part we're going to read about in Kit Klarenberg's article is going to go over in detail how the new National Security Act in the UK particularly goes after whistleblowers. I digress. The computer expert has effectively been tried, convicted, and sentenced as a terrorist. His term of imprisonment is comparable to that meted out to individuals convicted of the most heinous crimes. Aside from motives of retribution, Schultz is being made an example. His sentencing is a message that anyone exposing the crimes of the military and intelligence agencies amidst the U.S.-Israeli genocide in Gaza, preparations for broader wars, and a crackdown on democratic rights will be treated as they would in Saudi Arabia or another U.S.-backed dictatorship. In the first instance, the sentence is a signal of what the American government intends to do to WikiLeaks publisher Julian Assange, who faces the imminent threat of extradition from Britain to the U.S. The sentence is all the more striking, given the flimsy character of the case against Schultz, who maintains his innocence. There was sufficient doubt over his guilt for a jury to be unable to reach agreement on the Espionage Act and national security charges in a first trial of Schultz in 2020, resulting in a mistrial. Schultz has stated that he was fitted up because the government was desperate to find a scapegoat for the CIA data breach. As a disgruntled and idiosyncratic former CIA employee, he was identified as a suspect almost immediately after WikiLeaks began publishing the material in March 2017. Shortly thereafter, he was indicted on charges of possession of child pornography. Whatever their veracity, those charges were clearly aimed at ensnaring Schultz in the legal system, as the government sought to build a case. It took more than a year for the Department of Justice to cobble together an indictment against Schultz over the CIA leak. The timeline strongly suggests that the FBI and the government decided upon Schultz's guilt and worked backwards from there. WikiLeaks stated that the material it published on CIA hacking tools has been circulating amongst numerous former government employees and contractors. The limited coverage of Schultz's sentencing in the mainstream press has uncritically cited the statements of U.S. officials describing the leak as a digital equivalent of Pearl Harbor, an unprecedented blow to national security and the like. Very little has been written about the content of the leaks. Dubbed by WikiLeaks as Vault 7, the material pointed to a global CIA operation involving cyber hacking and dirty tricks at an unprecedented scale. Among the revelations, Vault 7 showed that A. The CIA was the world's biggest purveyor of malware. It developed viruses and hacking tools directed at virtually all operating systems. B. The CIA had developed programs enabling it to hack smart televisions and other household devices for spying purposes. That's Operation Weeping Angel. One of the most terrifying things I can think of. C. By hacking directly into smartphones, the CIA could overcome encrypted messaging apps. D. The agency was seeking to develop capabilities to remotely take control of the computer systems that run newer model cars. The only conceivable purpose would be to do physical harm. A little terrifying, isn't it? You know, your Tesla gets hacked, suddenly the brakes go out. I mean, this is really, really scary shit. And lastly, the CIA had developed capabilities to create digital evidence to attribute its own malicious hacking operations to adversaries, useful in black propaganda campaigns blaming other countries for cyber attacks. That's a big one too. So we're going to go over in more detail what was in the Vault 7 leaks, but it's probably the most damning evidence that has ever been dropped about the CIA. So you assume that, you know, they're going to do everything they can to smear Schultz. And he got a draconian sentence because this is a shot across the bow to whistleblowers. You know, this is what we will do to you if we even think you had anything to do with dropping sensitive information about the intelligence agencies or about, you know, higher ups, the billionaire class, anything that's very inconvenient, such as stuff about Epstein. That's very inconvenient for the rich. Kit Klarenberg just wrote a bombshell article about new questions coming up about the Epstein suicide, quote unquote. FOIA documents that they got at the Gray Zone seem to indicate that they were running with the suicide narrative before he even saw his body was even examined by anybody. I'll link to that. I'm not going to talk too much about it, but read that article. And then a picture starts to formulate as to why they are going after people like Kit Klarenberg and Julian Assange. I see a pattern. If you are doing inconvenient work against powers of, or centers of power, they will target you, they will smear you, they will censor you, and if those things don't work, they'll put you in fucking prison. So let's continue with this Mint Press News article by Whitney Webb explaining why the Vault 7 leaks are particularly problematic for journalists. And as usual, Whitney's like a decade ahead of everybody, so it would behoove you to just, follow her, listen to what she has to say, because a lot of the stuff she's talking about right now, mark my words, 7 or 8 years from now, she's going to look like, Whitney Webstradamus. She's way ahead of the curve. Very much worth subscribing to and reading everything that she puts out, if you can. This came out March 10th, 2017, after the Vault 7 leaks dropped. It's called WikiLeaks Vault 7 Release Paints a Grim Picture for Journalism. This past Tuesday saw the biggest shakeup in the tech world since Edward Snowden first revealed the full extent of the National Security Agency's Dragnet surveillance program nearly 4 years ago. Thanks to WikiLeaks' first publication of its Vault 7 documents, which detailed the CIA global covert hacking programs, the CIA's ability to bypass encryption and turn practically any internet-enabled electronic device into a covert microphone is now in the realm of public knowledge. While these revelations are troublesome for everyone, they are particularly concerning for journalists who often rely on encrypted apps and technological privacy for sensitive stories. WikiLeaks itself highlighted this point in a tweet made soon after the Vault 7 was released. Quote, CIA hacker malware, a threat to journalists, infests iPhones, Android, bypassing Signal and Confide encryption. This threat is particularly concerning given that the U.S. government, particularly the CIA, has a documented penchant for silencing and intimidating journalists with whom they take issue. Encrypted messaging programs have been touted as a solution for journalistic privacy in the post-Snowden world. The messaging app Signal, in particular, has been endorsed by prominent journalists and even Snowden himself. Now, this is old. I can't imagine they haven't figured out a way to also get Signal at this point. So take that with a grain of salt. This is outdated, and that makes this even scarier. It's 2024. This came out in 2017. However, some journalists have noted that Signal and other similar apps do not necessarily protect those under targeted surveillance, a concerning fact given that journalists are more likely to be targeted than other members of the general public for surveillance. Not only has the Vault 7 now proven that encrypted messaging apps have been compromised, it has also shown that the CIA's hacking capabilities span nearly every type of telecommunications device available to consumers, including smartphones, tablets, personal computers, and routers, and cars. In addition, the CIA is able to target everything from data and applications to operating systems and hardware, making no internet-enabled consumer electronic device safe from CIA surveillance. Among the CIA's hacking tools detailed in the release was a tool that allows the CIA to, quote, bypass the encryption of WhatsApp, Signal, Telegram, Weibo, Confide, and Cloakman by hacking the smartphones that they run on and collecting audio and message traffic before the encryption is even applied. Essentially, the tactics that many journalists have touted as effective in protecting their own privacy are rendered powerless by the CIA. And then we'll finish with this last part, or this is not the whole article, but this next part is the most important part. The decades-long CIA effort to undermine journalists' integrity. Journalists across the board have a great reason to be alarmed, chiefly due to the government's tendency to mercilessly prosecute journalists who dig too deep. The CIA has been wiretapping journalists for well over 50 years, with some of the earliest documented and officially confirmed cases taking place in 1963. Despite the fact that much of this surveillance was illegal, the CIA and the U.S. government has only expanded its surveillance of both journalists and everyday citizens in recent decades, particularly with the dismantling of civil liberties post 9/11. In addition, several prominent journalists have been silenced or imprisoned by the CIA or other parts of the U.S. power structure over the years. One very telling example is the case of Barrett Brown, a journalist and former member of the hacktivist collective Anonymous. Brown at one point faced a combined sentence of over 100 years just for writing about and linking to data that had been hacked. Brown was in no way involved in the hack, but his mere use of the hacked info as a source led him to be sentenced to over 5 years in prison. Sound like anything I just talked about in the last article? While Brown's politically motivated prosecution is no doubt concerning, many other journalists have suffered much worse at the hands of the CIA and the U.S. government. One particularly notable case is that of the late journalist Gary Webb, who famously exposed the CIA's drug-running operation between Nicaraguan U.S.-funded rebels and crack dealers on the streets of L.A. Despite the fact that Webb's claims have been vindicated in the years since, Webb was viciously attacked by the CIA and other news publications for his story, resulting in, quote, one of the most venomous and factually inane assaults on a professional journalist's competence in living memory. Webb committed suicide in 2004 as a result of the vicious attacks against him, though some have maintained that foul play may have played a role, considering early reports indicated that he died of multiple gunshot wounds to the face. Other well-known journalists like Michael Hastings and Udo Ofkot also are suspected to have died at the hands of the CIA after exposing the agency's wrongdoings. Yeah, and I don't know about you, but when I commit suicide, I shoot myself in the face multiple times, right? So this is super important, and this is a 7-year-old leak and a 7-year-old article by Whitney Webb. This stuff is far worse nowadays, I can only imagine. So let's move on to what Kit was talking about right before he was censored. And I do have some people that know Kit, and he's going to be back. They're even publicly, they've now posted that he's only suspended from Twitter for 3 months. So he will be back, and he's currently writing another bombshell article. So he's not backing down. My man, he just goes out there and hunts elephants. So I don't worry about him. He's at 45,000 subs right now on Twitter. By the time he comes back, it'll probably be 100,000. So I mean, they're sort of like helping him a little bit by censoring him, because it just, people nowadays, they look at somebody who's getting taken down and censored and they go, what kind of truth is that person dropping about the elites and the rich people, the big club? And that's exactly what Kit's been doing his entire career, and especially lately. So I will link to the Epstein article, which is his second most recent article. You can read that for yourself, but let's read about his most recent article, which arguably is even more uncomfortable for the elites. It's talking about the new National Security Act and how it basically mimics the Espionage Act for the UK. So this came out February 9th. UK steps up war on whistleblower journalism with new National Security Act. He starts off the article talking about how he was actually detained in Luton Airport when he was coming back. He's from the UK, and they held him in a dark room for 5 hours and interrogated him for no reason whatsoever. They took all of his phone, his laptop, and whatever. Asked him a whole bunch of questions about his work for the Gray Zone. You can read about that. That's another story for another time. But I want to start here talking about the actual National Security Act and how it mimics the Espionage Act. And basically the way that it does this is it sets traps for, everyday citizens who may want to blow the whistle on some shenanigans at a company that they work at, or, an agency that they work at. And if you get caught even doing something that is not even really considered to be illegal in the minds of normal people, like if you have the intention of blowing the whistle on something that should be public knowledge, there's all these tripwires built in so that you can get in trouble for even thinking about it. It's almost like pre-crime. So let's read to you specifically about it here. Inspired by the Espionage Act, it's designed to criminalize whistleblowing. In December 2023, after processing for 18 months through the parliamentary procedures, the British National Security Act came into force. Under the aegis of protecting Britain from the threat of espionage and sabotage by hostile actors at home and abroad, the law introduces a number of completely new criminal offenses with severe penalties and wide-ranging consequences for freedom of speech. Indeed, the law's terms are so broad, individuals will almost inevitably break a law without wanting to, intending to, or even knowing they have, and that's what I'm talking about. Because no one has been prosecuted under the Act to date, its full ramifications remain unclear. However, London's security and intelligence apparatus now enjoy far-reaching powers to police what can be said about the British government's activities abroad. Given the frightening implications of the Act, UK journalists, press rights groups, and civil liberties organizations should be up in arms. Yet serious criticism of the law was largely absent from mainstream publications throughout various phases of debate in the Parliament. Yeah, it's because mainstream publications are doing the bidding of the security state and the deep state. So they don't have to worry about this being used against them. They're just puppets. This is for good journalists. This is for taking down people like, well, Kit Klarenberg. Scrutiny of the Anti-Free Press Act has been left almost entirely to independent journalists like Mohammed El-Mazi. Writing for Consortium News in July 2022, El-Mazi noted that, quote, it shares many elements with Washington's draconian 1917 Espionage Act, which is currently being used to prosecute WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange. Quote, whistleblowers, journalists, and publishers focusing on national security-related matters may be most at risk of being prosecuted, El-Mazi warned. British lawmakers explicitly cited WikiLeaks in multiple parliamentary debates on the act. The motive behind the law, they insisted, was to prevent and deter quote-unquote unauthorized disclosures by any individual or organization ever again. Along the way, they repeatedly libeled WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange, parroting the demonstrably false narrative that the WikiLeaks exposure of the Western war crimes threatened innocent lives. For example, during a June 2022 House of Commons debate, a conservative parliamentarian asked Labour's Shadow Home Secretary Yvette Cooper if she condemned the WikiLeaks-type mass dumping of information in the public domain. They branded such activity, quote-unquote, hugely irresponsible as it can put lives at risk. Cooper responded that she strongly condemned such activity, quote, some of the examples of such leaks that we have seen put agents' lives at risk, put vital parts of our national security and intelligence infrastructure at risk, and are highly irresponsible. We need safeguards to protect against that kind of damaging impact on our national security. It's not damaging for national security. It's damaging to our national security apparatus, which is spying on us and creating destabilizing events all over the globe, spying on everybody, coups, the most clandestine shit ever that absolutely needs to be revealed, like, for instance, the Vault 7. They don't want any more Vault 7s. That's why this exists. In fact, a leaked 2011 Pentagon report concluded that there was no significant strategic impact to WikiLeaks' release of either the Afghanistan War Diary or Iraq War Logs provided to Assange by then U.S. soldier Chelsea Manning. During Manning's ensuing trial, U.S. government lawyers were forced to admit no one had been harmed in any way as a result of her disclosures. The prosecution conceded this finding during Assange's initial extradition proceedings in February 2020. A central pillar of the British state's case for the National Security Act is therefore based on lies. Careful there, Kit. You're going to get censored, and if they can't keep you censored, just be careful, buddy. We need you. We need you. When you say stuff like that, you're going to get in some trouble. An ongoing inquiry has been confirming a BBC investigation which revealed that an SAS squadron killed 50 people in suspicious circumstances in one 6-month tour, then falsified evidence to frame them as armed insurgents. In February 2011, following the British Special Forces killing of 8 unarmed Afghan civilians in a raid, one officer privately wrote to another, quote, whilst murder and the SAS have oft been regular bedfellows, this is beginning to look bone. His colleague replied, quote, I find it depressing that this has come to this, ultimately a massive failure of leadership, and when the next WikiLeaks occurs, we will be dragged down with them. Now, this is the most important part. This act specifically intends to criminalize WikiLeaks threatens whistleblowers. During the 2022 House of Commons debate, knighted Conservative MP Sir Robert Buckland led the charge against WikiLeaks. Buckland, who was responsible for in his former role as Secretary for State of Justice, Secretary of State for Justice, for, quote, upholding the rule of law and protecting judicial independence, argued that the National Security Act was a vital tool to prosecute those such as Julian Assange. This is a quote. Those such as Julian Assange who dump data in a way that has no regard for the safety of operatives and other affected people. He later remarked, none of us in Parliament wants to see Julian Assange and his type carry sway here. The UK Supreme Court expressed a very different view when in 2018 it held a unanimous decision that cables published by WikiLeaks are admissible as evidence in court proceedings. Another knighted Conservative lawmaker, Sir John Hayes, dismissed suggestions the National Security Act could impact the legitimate journalistic activities, arguing that it would only target, quote, a WikiLeaks-type disclosure dressed up as being by a guardian of liberty or some other such nonsense. Nonetheless, he conceded that while those primarily threatened by the legislation are those, quote, working directly for a foreign power, its targets could also include those, quote, not working directly for a foreign power, but might, emphasis added, be aiding a foreign power or acting directly for such a foreign power. So, careful there, Clit. You don't want to get licked by the national security state. Be careful, Kit. Sorry. Had to make jokes after that kind of slip of the tongue. Anyway, this is not a day to be making a lot of jokes, but you know me, I can't help it sometimes. Highly recommend you read the rest of all of these articles. They are very important, but I wanted to kind of broad strokes paint you a picture of exactly how dire the straits are for journalists nowadays, particularly Western journalists who are exposing the, skullduggery of the security state, the surveillance state, the real, actual centers of power. It's tough, and this might be our last days. I mean, if Julian gets extradited to the U.S. and he dies, I mean, symbolically that is devastating, but also literally it's devastating because it's a huge shot across the bow to anyone else who wants to do good journalism, good publishing, or any type of whistleblowing. You're martyring him, and it's tough to, come out here and do commentary or do journalism when that could possibly be the last thing you ever do. If you do a good job, it could be the last thing you ever do. So hopefully Julian does not end up going the way of Gary Webb. Hopefully not the same way as Joshua Schultz. But we will know pretty soon if he's being extradited to the U.S., which, remember, you can do something about. You can help him. Call Congress. Tell them to sign on to House Resolution 934, dropping the charges against Assange. Please do that if you can. I've done it. I'm asking you to do it. The more pressure we can cook up over this and the more eyes we can get on stories like this, the better chance that Julian and Kit and all the other prosecuted journalists and whistleblowers out there have in the future. This might be our last stand. I don't know if it, beyond the Assange case, if this goes south, it might end journalism as we know it. So, very, very scary time. Last point I'll make is something that's echoed by my good friend, Comrade Misty, which is this fight might be the most important fight, because if we lose our ability to speak freely, we can't fight about any of the other stuff that really matters. Fighting against war, fighting against big pharma, fighting against the deep state. All of that doesn't matter if we're not allowed to speak. And the First Amendment, and indeed freedom of the press in the U.S. and also the UK, I mean, they don't have a First Amendment like we do, but the freedom of the press is protected there. You'd think so. It's all under fire right now. It's on the chopping block, and the guillotine's falling. So we're just going to have to see if we can get our heads out of the way in time. Keep fighting that good fight out there, guys. I'll post links to all of these articles below. Please read through them all, and do what you can for Julian today. It's now or never. I'll talk to you later.